Jan Tyranowski is one of my newest favorite saint friends. And, everybody wants to be an influencer and everybody wants to do these grand things. But what is so crucial and is such an important example in Jan Tyranowski is that he's a hidden saint. I mean, again, he might get canonized and become one of those celebrity saints and everybody will know about him. But in terms of the way that he lived his life and as far as his popularity is now, he is a hidden saint. He's the introvert mentor behind the extrovert great John Paul the Great. And I especially appreciate him because he is so hidden for that reason. And Pope Benedict teaches us that the sign of the new covenant, and I quote, is humility, is hiddenness. The sign of the mustard seed. This is from his infancy narratives, which I'm reading right now because it's Advent. So, in many ways, he really is the perfect saint for us because each one of us, as Pope Benedict also said, each one of us is willed, each one of us is loved, and each one of us is necessary. So whether we're a great, out there on social media and doing these things, or we're living holy, hidden lives, each member of the body of Christ is crucial for the conversion of the church and for the conversion of the world. The second reason I'm really happy to be talking about Jan Tyranowski is because of what, if we want to be a great saint, we need to be formed by what formed the saints. And it was Jan Tyranowski that formed John Paul II in his Carmelite charism and in his Marian charism. And so he planted those seeds as a youth minister into the young Karol Wojtyla. And in doing so, gave us not only the most Carmelite pope, we might say, but also history's most Marian pope. Now, I say this wondering how Pope Leo XIII feels, because Pope Leo XIII wrote 12 encyclicals on the rosary. So I don't know if he's in the kingdom saying, wait a minute, why does John Paul II get that reputation? What about me? But I'm sure the saints in heaven are not that petty. But I have to think about Pope Leo, whose wonderful prayer of St. Michael that we prayed, just thinks, wait a minute, I'm at least tied with John Paul II. So I think it's so crucial to look at Jan Tyranowski and in looking at Jan Tyranowski to look at John Paul II, because we're living in a time of divine mercy. And something that John Paul II's papal biographer says is that we have to, at some point as a church, those of us who love John Paul II, stop looking back at John Paul II in a nostalgic way, but start looking forward to the third millennium, using his life as a roadmap for how we're to approach the challenges that we're living now in the third millennium. And I'm going to read you what St. Faustina wrote in 1937. This is from paragraph 1732. She says, "As I was praying for Poland, I heard the words, 'I bear a special love for Poland, and if she will be obedient to my will, I will exalt her in might and holiness. From her will come forth the spark that will prepare the world for my final coming.'" So if John Paul II is that spark that she was prophesying about in her diary, then it's so important to look at that spark, and so important to look at the spark that sparked the spark. So how's that for a tongue twister? So when I was in Poland in the summer of 2019, I was on George Weigel's, he nicknamed it his death march through Krakow, giving us a kind of a walking tour, historical tour of Krakow. And we get to the Church of St. Stanislaw Kostka, and I didn't quite know what was going on. I didn't know about Jan Tyranowski at this point, but George was passing out his prayer cards, multiple cards to each one of us, and we were to pray in front of his bones. And I could tell in his sense of passion and urgency that this was someone that if we didn't know who he was, we ought to know who he was. These are the words that changed Jan Tyranowski's life forever. "It's not difficult to be a saint." Jan heard these words given in a homily by a Salesian priest, because that parish of St. Stanislaw is a Salesian parish, the Salesians of Don Bosco. And he heard those words, "It's not difficult to be a saint." Now, at this point in Jan Tyranowski's life, he was a devout Catholic. He was very active in his parish, even though he was really introverted, and was part of Catholic Action. But those words, "It's not difficult to be a saint," was an inspiration from the Holy Spirit for him, and it launched him. It was the words, it was the Rhema word that launched him into his personal vocation. And when we think about our culture and all of the lies that are being spoken, how crucial it is even more to start to speak truth like that into each other's lives. It's not difficult to be a saint. He hears these words and he knows everything is going to be different for him now. Now, just to backtrack a little bit before that homily, Jan Tyranowski was born in 1901 into a middle-class family. His father owned a tailoring business, but Jan Tyranowski became an accountant. And he was very interested in many things, in science, photography, psychology, languages, the personality types, which I really appreciate because I really love the personality types. But in 1930, his health begins to fail, and he had stomach issues and so forth. So he stops working as an accountant and joins his father's workshop as a tailor, which he really was very happy about because there didn't have to be in an office anymore, didn't have to deal with people, and he could have it was more suited for his kind of loner personality. So he'd been working as a tailor for 5 years when he heard that homily. It's not difficult to be a saint. And at that point, he seeks out spiritual direction, serious spiritual direction. And I wonder if it was the same priest that gave that homily. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But that priest introduces him, talk about the saint behind the saint, the hidden saint behind the saint. That priest introduces him to the Carmelites, introduces him to St. Teresa of Avila and to St. John of the Cross. And these two doctors of the church have a huge impact on him. As we know, St. John of the Cross is the mystical doctor. St. Teresa of Avila is the doctor of the church on prayer. And he decides to take a vow of celibacy to give him a kind of vocation that allows for more time for contemplation. And he dedicates 4 hours of his day every day to contemplative prayer. Now, 5 years after that epic homily was preached, where he knew that he could be a saint, he makes that vow of celibacy, he immerses himself in Carmelite spirituality. This is now, we're in 1940, 5 years later, at least half the priests in Poland have been deported by the Nazis. So it's at this point in his personal vocation that Jan Tyranowski, as youth minister, emerges. And this is because the priests, half of them are now missing, and the remaining ones were nervous about what would happen if there were no priests left in Poland. How is the church, how is the faith going to continue? How is the faith going to continue to be transmitted? So they wanted a system of lay leadership and lay catechesis so that just in case all the priests were gone, the faith would continue. And in fact, at a certain point during Nazi occupation, there was only one priest left in that parish. So they kind of were prophetic, knowing that this was a big problem. And, as I'm telling you this story, I'm thinking about my own. I'm Armenian Rite. I'm Armenian Catholic. So we're in union with Rome, but we're in the Eastern rites. And just this past weekend, I had my bishop over for dinner, and he told me about when the Soviet Union fell, how he visited villages in Armenia that hadn't had a priest there for over 70 years. And he was the first priest to step foot in those villages, and how they greeted him, and that they were the generation that was raised by the generation that was raised by the generation that continued transmitting the faith without the presence of one single priest, and the honor and the privilege and that he felt being the first priest there to step foot in that. So when we return back here into Poland, this has happened before in many places where the faith continues to be transmitted through the domestic church without priests, without sacraments, which is hard for us to imagine. But this is how holy Polish people are, and many other countries in the world that have to deal with these persecutions. So here is Jan Tyranowski. He's been placed in charge of the youth, and this introverted, awkward guy, if you could say that, and he felt that way. And here comes in, just imagine it, John Paul II, this poet, actor, artistic type, handsome guy, and Jan Tyranowski rubs him the wrong way a little bit. He described him as a walking catechism. Like, who is this guy? And yet, despite the fact that they were both so different, because of Jan Tyranowski, John Paul II, instead of becoming a lay disciple like he had planned and a poet, he becomes a priest philosopher. So, this was a mentor-mentee friendship, spiritual fatherhood and sonship that lasted his whole life. And there was always a picture of Jan Tyranowski up in John Paul II's desk. So this is what John Paul II says about him, and I quote, "He was one of those unknown saints, hidden amid the others like a marvelous light at the bottom of life, at a depth where night usually reigns. He disclosed to me the riches of his inner life, of his mystical life, in his words, in his spirituality, and in the example of a life given to God alone. He represented a new world that I did not yet know. I saw the beauty of a soul opened up by grace." And in another text, John Paul II writes, and I quote, "It's hard to forget the conversations with him. One of these remains in my memory was a time when this simple man, who complained to his confessor that he does not know how to speak, talked late into the night about the nature of God and indeed what life with God is. He didn't quote others' words, but drew on his own experiences. He was the apostle of God's greatness, the beauty of God, the transcendence of God." And this is exactly what made Jan different as a youth minister. He was not just giving a cold catechetical lesson about these lofty abstract truths of faith that have nothing to do with real life, but drew from his own experiences because of all that time being fed by God in contemplative prayer, in mystical prayer. He was able to bring what could be, and many times is expressed as dry catechetical lessons, to life because he was embodying them in his life. So this is also very good for us because we don't need to worry so much about being great orators like John Paul II or great speakers, because it was really the truth and the authenticity of his experience in prayer that was so clearly provocative to John Paul II, to the young Carol. Also, along with the authenticity of his prayer life, was also his bravery, because if the Nazis caught Jan Tyranowski hosting youth group meetings, he would have been executed immediately. So everything that was happening that was Catholic was happening underground in a clandestine manner. But being a holy and brave youth minister is not enough. It cannot convert, and it certainly cannot make someone an intentional disciple. And I think that happened for the young Carol, for John Paul II, in two ways. In the first way, Jan gave him a leadership position in the Living Rosary group. So this is how Jan Tyranowski did youth ministry with these boys. He divided the boys into groups of 15. So he had 4 groups of 15 boys, and each of those 15 represented a mystery of the Rosary. And each of those 15 were led by one leader. So there were 4 leaders to lead each of these groups. Now, one of those 4 was the young Carol Wojtyła. So you can see that he organized, again, in a way that would transmit the faith if he somehow disappeared. So what he would do is each week he would have the 4 core team, you could say, in his apartment, teaching them, spiritually directing them. And then those 4 would then go out and mentor their own group of 15. And then once a month, the entire Living Rosary group, that's what they were called, would meet for a monthly catechesis together. But then Jan made himself available to anybody in the youth group that wanted to meet with him whenever they wanted. So it was a very kind of brilliant system. And this is what George Weigel says contributed to Carol's rapid maturation. He immediately was put in a leadership position. The second thing that I think kind of launched or accelerated John Paul II's discipleship and really the discovery of his priestly vocation and his intellectual vocation was what Jan gave him to read. And what he gave him to read is really what formed him in his Carmelite and Marian souls. And that, of course, is St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, but really St. John of the Cross. Because Jan was smart and he knew that the young Carol was a poet and interested in the arts, and John of the Cross was a poet and considered Spain's greatest poet. So this is what John Paul II says about that. And I quote, "Before entering seminary, I met a layman named Jan Tyranowski, who was a true mystic. This man, whom I consider a saint, introduced me to the great Spanish mystics, and in particular to John of the Cross. Even before entering seminary, I read the works of that mystic, especially his poetry. In order to read it in the original, I studied Spanish, and that was a very important stage in my life." What an ambitious John Paul II, or pre-John. You know, he was so captivated by John the Cross in Polish, he had to study Spanish to read it in the original Spanish. So he reads the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Dark Night of the Soul, the Spiritual Canticle, and the Living Flame of Love. And you could really say that St. John of the Cross became not just John Paul II's spiritual father, but also his intellectual father. The first published work of his in general was a poem that he wrote for a Polish Carmelite magazine. And then later, so John Paul II wrote 2 dissertations. I guess one isn't enough. And his first dissertation was on the question of faith, according to St. John of the Cross. And he even in the 4th year of seminary wanted to become a Carmelite and actually applied to the Carmelite monastery in Poland. But thankfully, Archbishop Sapieha, Cardinal Sapieha, said, no, rejected. He didn't give his bishop's approval and said to the young Carol, finish what you started. So he did. And I remember when I was studying in Poland that, and I don't know if this is originally George Weigel's joke, but it's a good one, in that Thomists write about what Carmelites experience. So, you know, it's pretty funny. I love our family disputes. Anyway, so I think what's incredible to me about this, when I place myself in Poland during Nazi occupation, is that while the Nazis really embody Nietzsche's will to power, right? That the goal of man is just to self-assert aggressively and take what he can, that here is John Paul II living under their tyranny and reading John of the Cross, who is saying exactly the opposite, much like Saint Therese of Lisieux in the Little Way, who is also Carmelite, of course, but saying exactly the opposite, which is that life and love and finding your happiness and finding yourself is about self-surrender. So just an incredible contrast in what he's reading and what's filling him and what's contributing to his joy and his happiness and the discovery of his vocation. Meanwhile, the Nazis are saying couldn't say the more opposite thing. So it's really in John of the Cross that he discovers that self-surrender is the expression of the complete act of love. And something that I also learned from George Weigel is that it was that the dogmatic constitution on, not the dogmatic constitution, the pastoral constitution on the church, Gaudium et Spes, in Vatican II, that paragraph 24, which says that man cannot find himself except through a sincere gift of self. And this is very St. John of the Cross. And so we see that is really so much of what embodied the lens by which John Paul II did everything. And you can really trace it to John of the Cross. And we see that also expressed in love and responsibility, in his theology of the body, and so forth. So there's a lot there that could be said, but, you know, John Paul II really believed that and he wrote this in a letter to Henri de Lubac. He said that that the whole problem of the 20th century, the bloodiest century in history, is an anthropological problem, and this is what he called his personalistic norm, that the human person created in God's image and likeness is valuable simply because he exists, and God has willed the human person simply for his own sake. And therefore you cannot treat people as objects of the state. You cannot objectify people. You can't treat them as instruments just to achieve your means, that they have dignity and value simply by the fact that God has willed them for their own sake. And so again, we see that while we see this kind of chaos and disaster of the 20th century, that John Paul II immediately identifies it as an anthropological problem, that if you don't understand what man is and what man is for, then you can justify anything. So now we need to move on to John Paul II's Marian soul. And this too is also a great legacy of Jan Tyranowski. So the young Karol was a little bit of a rebel in his early days against traditional Polish Marian piety. And he thought that it was too distracting, and it was taking many of the same arguments we hear today. Isn't Mary detract from Jesus? So Jan Tyranowski gives him St. Louis de Montfort's book, True Devotion to Mary, where we also receive that tradition of the total consecration to Jesus through Mary. And this also is so important for John Paul II, and it really clarifies to him that Mary is not an obstacle or a distraction, but all true Marian devotion is Christocentric and Trinitarian. And John Paul II writes, and I quote, that reading St. Louis de Montfort was a decisive turning point in my life. So we see another huge turning point for him. And this Marian model marks his whole papacy. We know that his papal motto is Totus Tuus, totally yours, to the Virgin Mary, and has on his papal coat of arms, he has that M there next to the cross. 1988, he writes an encyclical on the nature and dignity of women, which is also an inspiration for the Endow postulate, right? And he declares 1987, 1988, that year, a Marian year. And he took that Marian model of the church, the fact that Mary is the icon of the church, that in her fiat, in her receptivity, in her total surrender, which is the total and perfect gift and of self-love and self-gift, that this is the Marian model is the model of the church. Of all the different models of the church, the Petrine after St. Peter, the institutional aspect of the church, or St. John, the contemplative, or St. Paul, the evangelizer, the missionary aspect of the church, all these are legitimate images of the church, but all of them are consummated under the Marian model, that receptive total gift of self. And so he says this in a speech to the Roman Curia in 1987. And my imagination is so provoked and moved by this, because here is the sea of cardinals, the sea of men, and John Paul II says all of this is possible because of a woman. And this is the year we need to focus on the feminine genius. And there's so much more really that I could say about the Marian, about his Marian soul. Certainly we know about the connection. If you don't, maybe I can briefly tell you about his connection with Our Lady of Fatima and the assassination attempt on May 13th, 1981, on the anniversary of Our Lady of Fatima's apparition, and how his life was spared. And he credits his life being spared to Our Lady of Fatima. And after he recovers, he does a whole entrustment of the whole entire world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And I remember being in Poland, probably one of my favorite days in Poland. And if you haven't gone to Poland, or you have gone and you haven't gone to Zakopane, which is the area of the mountains that John Paul II loved to ski in and loved the outdoor activities there. I remember coming upon this shrine of Our Lady of Fatima and asking about the history of it, and learning that the people of Zakopane, when they found out John Paul II was shot, stayed up all night and day, praying and praying and praying in vigilance, and promised Our Lady of Fatima that if he didn't die, if he recovered, they would build a shrine to Our Lady of Fatima in Zakopane. And that's what that church of Our Lady of Fatima in Zakopane represents. It's the fulfillment of the vow of the Polish people of Zakopane, to John Paul II's recovery. So it's incredible. So I will say that before I conclude, my conclusion before the conclusion is about the death of Jan Tyranowski. And so he is very sick, and he spends 1 year in the hospital with tuberculosis and an infection that was most likely cancer that took one of his arms. So one of his arms had to be amputated. A priest was able to see him every day, and that living rosary group, that original youth group that he led, they divided up all the visiting hours. So he always had one of the boys in his youth group visiting him in the hospital. So he was never alone, which is so beautiful. And he never complained. He asked for forgiveness for anyone he might have offended. And it is said that he died with a smile on his face and with the one arm that he had left holding the crucifix to his chest. And he dies in March 1947. He was unable to go, but he was still alive when John Paul II became Father Carroll. And so that was beautiful that he was alive during his ordination, even though he couldn't go to his ordination. And when John Paul II was sent to Rome to study, this is what Jan Tyranowski said, and I quote, "I am lying here doing nothing, but I still want to work for the salvation of the world, as you young people are doing in seminary." And by the way, he had 11 of his youth group go and become priests. He says, "I don't want to remain idle. So I am offering up my pain for the benefit of all those in need and for Carol as well." And so I want to conclude by saying that, especially now in the year of St. Joseph, and also we have an extension on the Jubilee year of Our Lady of Loreto, which Pope Francis extended through 2021 due to the coronavirus. He said, we gotta do a redo here. That Jan Tyranowski is really a saint in our own times. And we see this as we continue to discern our own personal vocations, as the church gets smaller, as our country becomes more secular and therefore more hostile to the faith. What will emerge, the beauty that will emerge, is the fruit born from the lives of hidden saints like we can be if we follow in Jan Tyranowski's path. And so I want to conclude then by reading this passage from Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Gaudete et exultate, rejoice and be glad. This is what he says, and I think this is so helpful for me every time I read it. "Let us be spurred on by the signs of holiness that the Lord shows us through the humblest members of that people which shares also in Christ's prophetic office, spreading abroad a living witness to him, especially by means of a life of faith and charity. We should consider the fact that, as St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross," this is Edith Stein he's talking about, "suggests, real history is made by so many of them. As she writes," so this is now Edith Stein, "the greatest figures of prophecy and sanctity step forth out of the darkest night. But for the most part, the formative stream of the mystical life remains invisible. Certainly, the most decisive turning points in world history are substantially co-determined by souls whom no history book ever mentions. And we will only find out about those souls to whom we owe the decisive turning points in our personal lives on the day when all that is hidden is revealed."